The sea that morning looked indifferent. On June 19, 1944, somewhere west of the Marianas, a narrow gray periscope feathered the surface and steadied. Below it, in the cramped attack center of a new Gato-class submarine, a watch section moved with quiet economy. The captain, Commander Herman J. Kostler, leaned into the eyepiece, calling bearings and angles on the bow, speaking in clipped phrases over the hum of machinery and the faint hiss of air. Through the lens, the veteran Japanese carrier Shōkaku showed a purposeful rhythm. Aircraft landing into the wind, deck crews towing and chocking, the outwash of propellers rippling the sea astern. The image jolted with each swell, but the outlines were unmistakable. An 800-plus-foot deck, the island amidships, the slow, steady turn of a fleet at war. He had waited for this. Reports overnight placed a large surface force sliding up from the southwest. The last coherent carrier strike arm Japan could put to sea. Task Force 58, somewhere dozens of miles over the horizon, was ready to receive the attack. But on this morning, the first shots that mattered would be fired from under the waves. Kostler lowered the scope, breathed once, and called for the six-fish spread. Range short, deflection small, target speed brisk, escorts tense and close. The fire control party cranked the TDC, the torpedo data computer, a mechanical brain whose whirring cams and gears translated bearing, speed, and angle into geometry and hope. In the bow room, sailors eased 6 long steam torpedoes forward, until their noses kissed the tube stops. At 1100 local, plus or minus a few minutes, because at war you live by approximations, Cavalla exhaled steel. The boat shuddered, 6 times in sequence. The captain turned ship to bring the wakes away and ordered her down. Above, it would take roughly a minute for the first wakes to arrive at Shōkaku's beam. That minute carried the weight of thousands of man-hours, American industry, training, doctrine, and a quiet new confidence in torpedoes that, finally, did what they were supposed to do. In moments, the deck crews on the Japanese carrier would see the chalky trails and shout warnings, and somewhere a helmsman would put over the rudder. But water has inertia, and ships have momentum. One wake converged true, then another. A dull, heavy concussion rolled through the sea, then a second, then a third. Flames and dense smoke began to boil up around the forward and midships elevators. Shōkaku staggered but kept way on. She would not die quickly. Cavalla went deep and braced for the answer. Escorted carriers carry anger in quantity. Sonar pings, depth charges, propellers crossing bearings like mad hornets. The next hour would be as long as the boat had lived. But before the first salvo of ashcans fell, before the hull rang like a bell, Kostler allowed himself one brief thought. The math today looked good. What the Japanese expected, that June was a duel of wings. Long-range strikes guided by scouts and doctrine, with fleet carriers as the lens through which power was focused. What happened was that an American picket of submarines and radar-directed fighters collapsed the geometry of the fight. The mobile fleet found itself bleeding carriers before the air battle had fully formed. The spirit of the decisive battle, audacity, pilot skill, elan, could not override the system that the U.S. had built by 1944, intelligence fused to radar and fighter direction, torpedo weapons that finally ran true, and a production base that made losses tolerable. The Shōkaku would be struck not because she was careless or unlucky, but because she sailed into a lattice of detection and hard arithmetic that favored her enemy. The thesis is simple. The submarine that killed Shōkaku was the product of a system that prized coordination and reliability, while the carrier that died was bound to a doctrine that assumed contact and superiority would be achieved by spirit and reach. June 19th became a day when the math took over, when bearing lines and sortie counts, octane vapors and ventilation, radar lobe widths, and pilot training hours combined to decide a battle before the dramatic last frames. Cavalla did not duel. She solved an equation under pressure and sent the answer forward as exploding steel. The result altered the carrier balance in the Pacific in a matter of hours. The strategic stakes were baked in by mid-June. Operation Forager, the U.S. capture of the Marianas, threatened Japan's defensive perimeter and put B-29 Naididirtil Dantinai range lines over the home islands. Saipan landings began June 15th. By the 18th, tens of thousands of Marines and soldiers were ashore and busy driving inland. A carrier showdown had been forecast for months. Ozawa's mobile fleet, a mix of 3 fleet carriers and 6 light carriers plus battleships, cruisers, and destroyers, sortied from Tawi-Tawi to challenge. The U.S. Fifth Fleet, under Spruance, screened the beachhead with fast carriers under Mitcher. 24 carriers in the area, with roughly 1,350 carrier aircraft, made the looming engagement the largest carrier battle in history. The Americans laid a quiet trap west of the Marianas, a barrier line of submarines along the approach arcs, where scouts and carriers must pass. It was a conservative deployment, not brilliantly flashy. Put steel and periscopes where the enemy must go, communicate quickly, and let geometry do the rest. Among the boats in that screen were Albacore and Cavalla. If the mobile fleet tried to reach in with long arms, submarines might cut the tendons. If the Japanese shoved through regardless, radar-directed fighters would meet them at long range and shred their edges. The beachhead would survive. The mobile fleet would not. Japan's doctrine for the day assumed several things that had once been reasonable. First, land-based air power on Guam and Rota could complicate the American fighter picture, drawing cap away and forcing divided attention. Second, the long reach of carrier strike groups, massed deck loads launched from beyond the U.S. radar horizon, would find and hit Task Force 58 with enough weight to put ships out of action. Third, veteran carriers like Shōkaku, despite repairs and scars, still offered a core of skill in deck operations and strike assembly. And finally, fuel and logistics would suffice for a decisive thrust west of the Marianas. In practice, the assumptions cracked. Radar on U.S. carriers and escorts, backed by purpose-built fighter direction procedures and CICs, extended the American sight picture outward by dozens of miles. Early vectors put Hellcats into Japanese strike packages before they could form tight, disciplined formations. The Japanese scouting system, heavily dependent on visual search and long-range seaplanes, was outclassed by an American network that fused code-breaking cues, radar returns, and well-drilled radio control. Meanwhile, both sides had gasoline. Only one side had a mature understanding of how to manage flammable vapors in damaged ships at high tempo. Taiho would demonstrate the danger in hours. Shōkaku would follow. The American design and training baseline in June 1944 mattered more than slogans. Cavalla herself was new, commissioned February 29, 1944, and she carried the technology stack of the late-war Gato, surface search, SJ radar, an SD air warning set, TBT optics, and an analog TDC in the attack center. Her hull was tough and roomy enough for long Pacific patrols, her diesel-electric plant reliable. Her sonar team drilled between steel decks and cork tiles that transmitted every sound. Her radar masts and fairwater had been shaped by 2 years of experimentation, and her crew had practiced submerged approaches until the sequence became muscle memory. The question of torpedo type matters less than the fact of reliability. By mid-1944, the U.S. Mark XIV's long saga of depth-keeping and exploder faults had finally been dragged through fixes. The high-speed-only Mark 23 variant, where carried simplified what worked. By early 1944, both steam weapons were scoring at scale. Some boats also took Mark 18 electrics for wakeless approaches. Cavalla's patrol report and official histories credit a 6-torpedo steam spread and 3 solid hits. Japanese signals and survivor accounts sometimes argue 4. The conservative floor is 3. Training runs through this story. U.S. submarine officers lived in the TDC and periscope, drilled on constant bearing intercept, and judged target speed and angle by habit. Radio discipline in ComSubPac was tight but adaptive. Wolfpack communications by directional SJ were used when appropriate. Every element aimed to shorten the decision loop from contact to firing solution. The Cavalla that watched Shōkaku landing planes that morning was a platform. But more importantly, she was a practiced team. First contact came in layers. Albacore found itself inside Ozawa's main carrier group earlier that morning and took a shot at the brand-new flagship, Taiho. Depth charges pounded back as the submarine slid away. Hours later, mishandled aviation gas vapors would rip the flagship apart. At roughly the same time, Cavalla was closing on a cluster of large silhouettes, guided by earlier reports and her own radar and sonar work. Kostler saw an opening. A recovering deck meant predictable ship handling, relative heading into the wind, and reduced escort's agility for minutes that counted. With Cavalla already trimmed and quiet, he flattened the last approach and called the spread. The hits came in a cluster. Flames reached for sky near the forward elevator. Another detonation blew debris from amidships. The Japanese carrier began to list and slowed briefly before damage control got her moving again. Within minutes, the escorts clothed the water in angry splashes. Depth charges are both crude and elegant. Barrels of chemistry set to go off approximately where they think you are, hoping concussive force and shock will do what steel can't. Cavalla went below thermal layers and turned, rigged for silent running, and felt the hull flex with near bursts. For long minutes the ocean was thunder and rain, bolts shaking the tools in the racks. In that pressure and noise, Kostler's team stayed on procedure. Listen. Drift. Move. Listen again. Use the temperature gradient. Count the propellers above. Track the kill. Meanwhile, Shōkaku fought for life. The first large fires were attacked, aviation tanks and lines isolated where possible, and counter-flooding ordered to keep the ship upright enough for steering. Fires on a carrier hangar deck are a form of math that ships hate. Flaming fuel, hot air rising, draft increasing through every open space, and ordnance sitting in racks like fuses. The initial blazes could be beaten. But somewhere in the ventilated spaces, a volatile mix gathered and migrated, precisely the hazard that would doom Taiho that afternoon. The turning point for the day, writ large, unfolded in the air while Cavalla hid and Shōkaku burned. Ozawa's first and second strike waves pushed toward TF-58, hundreds of planes that on paper should have hammered the American screening groups. Instead, radar on carriers and cruisers painted the inbound tracks early. Fighter direction officers working in CICs read bearing, range, altitude, and speed-off plan position indicators and vectored Hellcats out along the approaches. The U.S. pilots flew disciplined interceptions and killed aggressively. It became the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, a phrase that obscures how much planning it took to make killing look easy. By day's end on the 19th, Japanese carrier air power had been mauled. Roughly 300 to 400 aircraft destroyed across the 2 days, with 550, 645 total losses when land-based planes are counted. American losses were on the order of 123 aircraft, many lost in a night recovery on the 20th rather than in the interceptions themselves. For Shōkaku, the day's arc bent toward catastrophe at approximately 1400. After hours of fire and intermittent smoke, a powerful internal explosion, vapor-driven, erased the ship's margin. Bulkheads blew out. The flight deck heaved. The carrier's innards turned to a pressure cooker with vents. She went down stern first within minutes. Light cruiser Yahagi and destroyers Urakazi, Wakatsuki, and Hatsuzuki hauled survivors from the slick, including Captain Matsubara. The numbers were both specific and numbing. Roughly 570 saved. Over 1,200 dead, including many from the air group, a loss that could not be made good in 1944 Japan. Behind the scenes, the logistics and production machine shaped the battlefield as surely as any torpedo. U.S. training pipelines for aviators and submariners had stabilized after the lean early years. Replacement aircraft flowed in volume. Spare engines and propellers sat in depot. Carriers rotated task groups through replenishment with oilers and escort logistics ships. Torpedo production had scaled, and by early 1944, the failure modes that once haunted skippers in 1942–43 had mostly been crushed by empirical testing and blunt leadership. The submarine force was now armed with weapons that did not lie. Japan's system, by contrast, was brittle. Oil was scarce and of poor quality at key bases. Pilot training hours had shrunk, and the Naval Air Arm's experienced cadre had been attrited by 1942–43. Damage control doctrine on carriers had not adapted fast enough to the realities of high-tempo strike ops under attack, where the hangar became a hazardous box breathing vapors. The Mobile Fleet's radius still looked formidable on the map. The human and technical depth under that radius had thinned. When Tai-Ho and Shōkaku fell on the same day, one to a single torpedo and bad ventilation, the other to 3 or 4 torpedoes and similar chemistry, it signaled not just tactical losses, but a production and doctrine shortfall that months could not repair. Intelligence, command, and control stitched the day together. The Americans had a strategic picture from code-breaking and traffic analysis that indicated when and from where a major sortie would come. Submarines were placed along the most likely axis of advance, an economy of force move that cost little and could pay high. At the tactical level, radar sets, SK and others, on carriers and cruisers fed CICs where fighter direction officers made vectoring choices. The loop from sensor to shooter closed in minutes, not hours. And when the air picture thinned, submarines and search aircraft kept contact enough to guide follow-on strikes the next day. On the Japanese side, scouts did fly and contacts were made, but the degree of fusion was less. Radar existed in some forms but was not central to doctrine. Communications under attack degraded. Strike packages arrived in fragments. Recovery accidentally exposed carriers to submarine geometry as Cavalla exploited. It was not that the Mobile Fleet could not fight. It could not fight the fight it wanted. The human capital gap widened every minute on June 19th. Hellcat pilots with hundreds of training hours and disciplined radio control met formations including green. Japanese aviators, veterans now rare. U.S. gunnery practice, both shipboard anti-aircraft and fighter deflection shooting, had systematized what had been ad hoc in 1942. On the decks below the fight, American damage control training emphasized decentralization and air management. Repeated drills built muscle memory. Japanese sailors were brave and capable, but many fought fires with fewer procedures and less redundancy, especially regarding gasoline vapors under deck. On Shōkaku, that difference translated into minutes that ran out. Submariners feel this gap, too. U.S. boats in 1944 rotated through refresher training and briefings that mined every patrol for lessons: periscope handling, solution generation, evasion. Each had a checklist, a feedback loop, and a standard. When Cavalla took depth charges, she was not saved by luck alone. She was saved by practice turns inside the escort search plans, by listening for propeller counts, by using known layer depths to bend sound. Skill and nerves matter. So does drilling skill into reflex. A key doctrinal shift underlay the day. The Americans refused the enemy's preferred fight. In pre-war imagination, a carrier battle meant symmetrical deck loads charging across the ocean to deliver decisive blows. In June 1944, the Americans inverted that picture. Submarines shaped the opening hours. Radar and fighter direction turned the midday into a series of intercepted fragments. Only later did U.S. carriers launch heavy strikes to finish and pursue. It was a system designed to preserve the beachhead and attrit the enemy, not to court risk for spectacle. That was Spruance's instinct, and it fit the math. Nuance matters. The Japanese still fought back hard. Individual pilots scored hits, and some formations broke through. U.S. ships and aircraft were lost. On the 20th, a risky late-day strike led to difficult night recoveries and heavy operational losses. Around 80 aircraft in landings and ditchings, proof that even a winning system has edges. And the debate over how many torpedoes Shōkaku took will likely persist between 3 confirmed and possibly 4. A reminder that eyewitnesses and signals conflict under stress. Conservative historians land on 3 hits out of 6 fired. Others argue 4. The precise count does not alter the operational truth, but should be marked for. Roll the numbers up because numbers are how the day actually spoke. Across June 19th to 20, the Japanese lost roughly 645 aircraft, carrier and land-based combined. 3 carriers sunk: Taiho, Shōkaku, light carrier Hyo, and additional ships damaged. About 2,887 personnel killed by one estimate. U.S. losses came to roughly 123 aircraft, with 109 dead across the fleet for the 2 days. Cavalla committed 1-6 torpedo salvo that produced 3 to 4 hits. A carrier kill worth 25,000 to 30,000 tons standard displacement removed from the order of battle. She survived a heavy counterattack, evaded, and reported. The sinking coordinates sit in a tight box around 11 to 50 Q12 to Guan0N. Chunchun Nadi, Jonju Juisi, Inchuan Shinchandirigi, Joinin Chui. These are stark ratios. Air losses on the order of 415.1 in U.S. favor in the air battle and the removal of elite decks that Japan could not replace. Psychology and operations bled together after June 19th. Japanese diaries and after-action assessments spoke of brave pilots and uncooperative radar pictures, of mistimed launches and fighters recalled from Guam to meet inbound threats. On surviving carriers, the awareness that veteran decks were gone settled fast. For the Americans, the day validated doctrine. Fighter direction worked, radar pickets mattered, the submarine barrier had paid a dividend. The result was not triumphal glee, but a sober sense that the enemy's carrier arm had been broken. It did not mean the war was over. It meant the Pacific's geometry had shifted for good. On Cavalla, the crew rode out the depth charges and felt the ocean grow quieter. Inside the boat, the attack center smelled of oil and sweat, and the men exhaled only after the last patterns faded. Then came reports through channels. One carrier believed sinking, one already confirmed gone. The boat had done her part. The system had done the rest. The aftermath played out over months. With Shōkaku and Taiho gone and air crews lost in quantity, the mobile fleet's ability to contest sea control collapsed. The Americans secured Saipan and then Tinian and Guam, setting the stage for heavy bomber operations against the home islands. In October, at Leyte Gulf, the Japanese tried a decoy carrier plan. Shōkaku died there, her air group a shadow. The center of gravity moved inexorably west. The U.S. submarine campaign tightened the choke on oil and transport. The math kept grinding. Ethics and civilians have a place even in a submarine carrier tale. The loss of Shōkaku killed more than 1,000 sailors and airmen in minutes. Survivors struggled in oil-slick seas as escorts did what they could. On Taiho, crewmen suffocated or burned in the hangars. No civilians were afloat on these ships in action, but Japanese civilians would suffer the strategic consequences of a battle that opened the bomber door. The narrative of efficiency and doctrine should not glamorize the human cost. Facts are enough. Legacy and doctrine converged on a few strong lessons. Submarine barriers, properly informed by intelligence and linked to a larger plan, can decide battles before the headline phase. Fighter direction, radar, and CIC procedures make air superiority a product of system engineering as much as pilot virtuosity. Torpedo reliability underwrites submarine doctrine. Bad weapons rewrite history. Good ones can, too. Damage control in the age of gasoline and steel decks is about ventilation and chemistry as much as hoses and courage. Taiho and Shōkaku tell that story in fire. Post-war, navies codified these lessons in training syllabi, design standards, and the quiet bureaucracy of checklists. The math of dominance moved from art to routine. Return to the periscope, the feather on the water, the steady hands on handles. The image in the glass was just a ship landing planes. The calculation behind the image involved months of planning, decades of engineering, and a few minutes of nerve. When Cavalla fired, she did not win the war or even the battle by herself. She acted as a node in a network and sent a solution into a hull that could not survive it. Hours later, a carrier slid under at roughly 11 degrees 50 EN, 137 degrees 57 E, one more coordinate in a sea that remembers by numbers. The metaphor is simple because the day was simple. Put the right mathematics in the right place, and even giants sink.